Ladies and gentlemen, as with every World Press Freedom Day commemoration, we have always been lucky to have had so many guests of honor, both locally and international, who represent and embody the press as we know it today. So, this very day, we are very blessed and honored to have Mr. Pichai Chuensuksawadi, the Editor-in-Chief of the Bangkok Post, to grace us with his presence and deliver the keynote address. Mr. Pichai has had an extensive career in journalism spanning over 20 years, and Mr. Pichai has been an editor-in-chief at Post Publishing Public Co. Limited since 2002. He has also served as editor at the Bangkok Post at the Post Publishing PLC from 1994 to 2002, and special assistant to the ASEAN Secretary General Dato' Ajit Singh from 1993 to 1994. He serves as the chairman of the Bangkok Post Provident Fund and is also the chairman of the Bangkok Post Foundation and Food Hong Leper Foundation. He is a member of the Press Council of Thailand and is a board member of the IFRA, in which he observes his role as chairman. So without any further ado, it brings me great pleasure to invite Mr. Pichai to deliver his keynote address.
Deputy Chairman of AIDCOM, Azman Ujang, Professor Dr. Anwar Ahmad, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Selangor, my fellow colleagues, panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Like many United Nations bodies, media organizations, and rights groups across the globe, we're meeting here today, as been mentioned, to remind the people of the world, to remind governments and relevant institutions of the significance and importance of supporting freedom of expression and press freedom. Now, World Press Freedom Day has been held actually for over 20 years now. And surprisingly, despite repeated pleas, media organizations in many countries still, newspapers, televisions, and radio stations, are still being, in one way or another, censored. As has been mentioned, editors and reporters face fines, licenses are suspended, and in some cases, media organizations are closed down. There's been some progress, I believe, in this region, but still, across the globe, this sort of practice still exists. At the same time, journalists, editors, and publishers are still being harassed. They're attacked and they're detained. In the booklet that's been distributed, for example, you'll see examples of this. No one really knows, I think, how many people and how many incidents like this have happened over the last 20 years. But what we do know, and in the booklet it says there are a number of journalists who talked about the ultimate sacrifice, 70 journalists killed in 2013. But what we do know is that since 1992, when World Press Freedom Day was initiated and held every year across the globe, 1,052 journalists have been killed in the line of duty across the globe. And of that number, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 703 were murdered. They were murdered because they were doing their job. These journalists were covering areas, and it should come to no surprise, politics, corruption, crime, human rights. The other 300 that were killed basically in the line of duty in covering wars. They weren't targeted, but they were doing their job, but they were covering wars and skirmishes or even protests. But 703 were murdered because they did their job. Since 1992 in Southeast Asia, fortunately, the number is not that high, but of the 702, roughly 10% were killed in Southeast Asia. Sadly, the Philippines has the highest toll, 72. 8 in Cambodia, 8 in Indonesia, 6 in Thailand, none in Malaysia. We don't really know the figures from Myanmar. Myanmar has just, as we all know, emerged, but we do know that the incidence of detainees is a lot. But how many were actually killed because they were trying to do their job, we may never know. Now, to me personally, the most important point of World Press Freedom Day is to honor those journalists who lost their lives because they were seeking and they were doing their job of seeking the truth. They died because they were trying to right wrongs and injustices in the society in which they served. And the lives of these journalists were taken because they pursued the principle in which we all cherish. Now, as a young reporter, I experienced very briefly hiding and ducking mortar attacks while covering the border clashes between, at the time, Burmese troops and Karen minority rebels on the Thai-Burmese border. I've covered military coups. I've covered the military crackdown in May of 1992 when soldiers marched and opened fire on pro-democracy demonstrators, for those of you who have been in Bangkok, along Radamdun Avenue. And as editor, I've been interrogated a couple of times by Special Branch Police for something that we published, demanding that we release or inform them of the sources of our information on certain stories. And I've only really spent one day behind bars. And the Thai jail is nothing you want to be in. In waiting for bail in one of the, I think, criminal defamation cases I faced in my first stint as editor of the Bangkok Post. Now, as editor of an English language paper, I can't remember the figure, but it was about 10, 12 cases in 8 years. That number is small compared to what an editor of a Thai language newspaper faces. He faces double or 3 times that amount of criminal defamation cases. The examples I just mentioned about my personal experience really is nothing compared to the journalists who have been murdered because of their profession. How many journalists can say that they're prepared to continue doing their jobs despite the threat of violence and death? How many are prepared to make that ultimate sacrifice? And to me, this is the most important point of World Press Freedom Day, to honor the journalists who made the ultimate sacrifice. And for this reason, ladies and gentlemen, I am really humbled and honored to be before you here this morning on this auspicious occasion. I really would like to thank EDCOM and the University of Selangor for the privilege and opportunity of sharing my thoughts and views with you on fostering freedom of expression today. Now, we all know we live in an age where there's an explosion in the ability of many millions to have greater access to information. But even more significant, the rise and spread of the internet, as has been mentioned, and social media platforms have allowed people to assemble, to disseminate information, to express their views and opinions virtually instantaneously. It's no surprise, and it's been happening over the last 10 years, that the ordinary man in the street, as well as special interest groups and non-government organizations, are able to report the news via text, photos, or videos. They can raise questions, they can challenge authorities on issues that are relevant to their daily lives. And one could argue that freedom of expression has never been stronger. And as the Deputy Chairman says, what more do we want? The ability of citizens to speak their minds, to question, to raise issue, and disagree with government policies and actions is a positive development. But governments and local authorities placed under the microscope more than ever before often view the explosion of dissenting views as political threats. And they respond, with heavy legal punishment that is tantamount to censorship. And censorship, we all know, often leads to the abuse of power, the suppression of truth, which invariably affects press freedom. And while I firmly oppose this standard response to greater freedom of expression by ordinary citizens, I have to admit that there are definite pitfalls and what I would describe as an even darker side of this relatively newfound freedom. Now, I'm sure many of you here in Malaysia are aware of these pitfalls when reports by netizens are unchecked, unverified, or lack balance. And I'm certain that still continues today. Now, as you're all aware, Thailand is going through a very prolonged period of political instability since the military coup against former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra in 2006. Now, I will not go into the details of where Thailand stands at the moment, where we're heading, or what will happen next. I am prepared to answer those questions later on, but certainly not go into it in this speech. But needless to say, that Thais are divided as never before. Emotions run high on either side of the divide, and in this extremely polarized political environment, the ease of information dissemination, the freedom to express one's views, has given rise to a deeply worrying increase in lies, misinformation, hate speeches, and dehumanizing comments from supporters on both sides. Let me give you an example. Protesters against the government. You've seen it on TV, you've seen it in reports, going in the thousands and tens of thousands, calling other Thais buffaloes who eat grass. They're uneducated, therefore their vote is not worth as much as ours. There's even an organization which has emerged to protect the monarchy, to enforce the Les Vejes law, Article 112, calling itself the Rubbish Collection Organization. What do you do with rubbish? You get rid of it. This adds and fuels the lack of tolerance and openness in Thailand. And as a result, the benefits of the internet, social networking, and media platforms are being questioned. Now, even the traditional media in Thailand has not escaped unscathed in this toxic political climate. Some have been accused of partisan and biased in favor of one side of the conflict or another. Others, fortunately because of their ingrained code of conduct and professional safeguard mechanism, have at least ensured that they have not fallen to the point of becoming all-out propaganda tools of one side or the other. And still this development takes shape, fundamental journalistic principles of objectivity and neutrality are at its core. It undermines the struggle for freedom of expression. Now, what's happening in Thailand now, in the situation that I've just mentioned, and the instances I've just given you, is probably not severe or as severe in countries of this region. Yet I'm sure that there are many countries which face a similar challenge to a lesser degree, and ask ourselves, what do we do about this darker side? Despite this darker side, I still firmly believe that the press needs to stay the course and fight government efforts to hinder freedom of expression. Censorship and laws stifling dissenting views is not the answer. But before I elaborate on how I believe we should deal with this dissemination of lies, half-truths, misinformation, and hate speeches, I ask that we do a little bit of soul searching. I think we need to ask ourselves, why has there been such a rapid boom in social media, and especially citizen journalism? Why have some people stopped reading what we print and publish? Why have they sought news and information from others? I think you know the answers. Clearly, the internet has opened the pathways to a new world of information and access. And people can choose to read and view videos when they want at their leisure. And they can do it almost anywhere. At first, it was the PC, the laptop, and now it's the mobile and the tablet. And eventually, I believe the PC and the tablet will be superseded by these small devices, which they can do it whenever they want. And my point is that the emergence of citizen journalism and the use of social media did not come about only because the technology was there. In part, its popularity rose quickly, I believe, because of our own failure. That of the mainstream media, our own failure to report what is happening on the ground from the perspective of ordinary people. We cannot deny that mainstream media, the Bangkok Post included, general report on the views of policymakers or focus on people with positions, and not the ordinary citizens affected by the policies. Our challenge, therefore, is not only to give meaning or insight into the current information overload and fragmentation. What we must do better in reporting realities on the ground from the point of view of the ordinary person. And we need to do this while remaining true and to the old journalistic tradition that by reporting the truth or competing truth in a complex environment, we do so, then we can create a better future. The burgeoning of social media and sudden explosion of emotive opinions makes journalistic principles of objectivity and protection of freedom, of press freedom, even all the more important. And with all this avalanche of opinions, the press has a duty to give the audience well-rounded facts that reflect the complexity of situations so that reason can prevail over prejudice. This is what I think we should do. But is that all? What else can be done? Now, in our profession, our freedom is counterbalanced by journalistic responsibility of fairness and balance. These are our core values, and we have, and no matter which country we serve, and I stress the word serve, we serve, there are codes of conduct which we must abide by. This is not the case of the individual net users. And the challenge, therefore, is how do we strengthen these values that we cherish, the principles, the code of conduct, and responsibility for the net users to abide by. Now, Facebook, for example, has functions which allows users to report abuse as a tool of mutual control. But I believe that it will help greatly if net users internalize the core values that we cherish somehow in the expression of their views. And these values include tolerance, respect for cultural plurality and differences. Now, all societies teach these values. All societies emphasize the importance of truthfulness and the importance of listening. And they frown upon divisive speech and lies. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was a situation in Thailand where the freedom of expression, the ability to express in a highly polarized political environment, has led to this dark side. There are instances, and I can say many of them, where friends for 30, 40 years, chatting on Facebook, unfriending each other. There are instances where friends for over 20 years having a drink, talking politics, and end up stabbing each other. There are instances where families cannot and do not talk to each other because they hold different political views. Where is the tolerance? Where is the listening? Where is the understanding? That is why the role of the press must go beyond that. It's got to the stage now where there's a saying in Buddhism, and I'm not a Buddhist, but it goes something like this, where there is a teaching called right speech. Now, the teaching goes that when we speak, we must be truthful. But in what we say, it must promote harmony, and it must be useful, and it must be spoken at the right time. If it's not useful, and it's not the right time, then don't say it. Some people will say, well, that's not freedom of expression. What I'm saying is this is happening in Thailand because of the divide. The values that I mentioned that to promote tolerance need to be strengthened. And quite frankly, it's not the sole responsibility of the press and media to do this. The fact is, we cannot do it alone. Certainly not in Thailand, and if a situation emerges elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the press cannot do it alone. It needs to start in the home, with the family, at schools, at madrasas and universities, at temples, churches, and mosques. All play a role. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, all sectors of society needs to foster these values in this newfound medium of freedom of expression. Otherwise, the dark side can emerge and make further damage to the very core essence of what we believe in. In that way, I believe, we have to work together as a society to foster freedom of expression. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.